Joining me again is Jay Goldberg with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and David Clement with the Consumer Choice Centre. David, before we went to commercial, I painted some potential fears that Ontarians have. We have experienced in a few generations ago high interest rates. We've experienced recession. What happens with all this debt and spending to the deficit? What happens with this debt that we carry in Ontario, the largest sub-sovereign of any place? What happens if the interest rates go up?
I mean, that's a very good question. And it really comes down, there are two big problems with this. And the first is what happens to the status of government debt? So how much of the province's debt is at risk if interest rates go up a quarter, half, or a full percent? That obviously drastically inflates the size of Ontario's total debt. And then there's a consumer and private debt side of this. Folks who may be a little over leveraged on their homes. What happens if interest rates go up on them? We're in the middle of what I think is a unprecedented housing price inflation. What happens to those folks when interest rates go up? Folks have maybe just bought a house. And so it really is not to sound like too much of a doomsday predictor, but it is quite scary, because if rates were to go up 1%, that might not sound like a lot to viewers and listeners, but that would have a drastic impact on both sides of that debt equation.
So, Jay, I want you to chime in here. What happens to the debt if we can't pay for it? What happens if the interest goes up? I mean, do we just keep borrowing and borrowing till what end?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's what the situation will be. Our deficit this year is set to be $21.5 billion. That's the largest in the history of the province. And so it's extremely concerning. And actually, right now, we're spending more than $1 billion a month on debt interest. So we're already spending a ton of money. That's more than we spend on post-secondary education. And if interest rates go up, we'll be looking at much more than $1 billion a month. And so you think of all the services we can't invest in, more investments in healthcare, education, perhaps implementing some of the tax cuts that the Ford Conservatives promised last time. And instead, we're spending over $1 billion a month just on debt interest. And that's not paying down the debt, that's just paying interest, the bondholders. So that's really getting us nowhere. Right. And we're wasting a lot of money on that. That's only going to get worse in the years ahead if interest rates go up.
And it probably will also turn off investors. I mean, even bondholders, how many people would want to invest in Ontario knowing we have such a huge, massive debt and we can't seem to get our house in order?
And how many people will still want to work in Ontario? So if COVID has shown anything, I mean, I'm doing this show from a different continent at this moment. So how many folks in COVID have realized that their form of employment is maybe a lot more flexible than they first thought in terms of where they live? And obviously, we live in a country where people can move to different provinces. We live in a very interconnected global world, and COVID has put a dent in that, but I'm sure it will return. So what happens if folks move and taxpayers leave and decide, I'm going to pay my provincial income tax in Alberta, or I'm going to pay it, I'm not going to pay it at all. I'm going to live in the United States, or I'm going to live elsewhere. And I think we could be in for a pretty rude awakening, given now that so many people are attuned to the fact that they can do their jobs from almost anywhere.
Right. That's a very good point. What happens when we become a have-not province? What happens?
And I was going to say that's exactly why Premier Doug Ford needs to implement some of those tax cuts he promised Ontarians last time to make Ontario a very attractive place to be, particularly as we're fighting high levels of debt, high deficits, and the interest rates we're talking about.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a whole banquet of taxes, I suppose, we can go through, and cuts that he alleged to or he promised. Jay, you wrote something very interesting, and we've got to cut to commercials, so I'll just kind of tease our audience with this. You wrote, when Ford declared the party is over with the taxpayers' money, it seems that he only meant the Liberal Party with the taxpayers' money was over, and that Ford has decided to throw a party of his own and is even more expensive than the one he ended. I thought you said it very well. In 20 seconds, what did you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that spending is way up under Premier Ford. It went up $5 billion over what Kathleen Wynne was spending, and that was before we had the pandemic.
Right, right.
Of course, we've seen the pandemic now, and we can certainly talk more about that on the other side.